They aren't true. It never happened. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, those are the words of former Vice President Joe Biden in his first public remarks direct from his mouth on a news interview setting about allegations brought by Tara Reade that when she was a staffer in his office in the Senate in 1993, that he sexually assaulted her. His campaign has previously released denials, but today he did two things, and we record this on Friday, so you're seeing this after the weekend, but he came out on Medium, a website that does kind of long-form blogging. It's an essay website, and made a statement. Just for curiosity's sake, it took him 8 paragraphs to get around to the mention of this incident. The first 7 paragraphs were talking about his great record with women. And then he did a long sit-down interview in his basement with Mika Brzezkinski, the Morning Joe co-host on MSNBC. Bill, first of all, before we get into the details of what he actually said here, Biden has been criticized in the past for being slow to make public statements. And now he has come out and basically nailed down what his campaign has said before. What, if anything, do you think is the impact of him waiting so long to personally appear on camera and talk about this?
I can't state what's going on in Joe Biden's mind. I don't think Joe Biden can do that. But I can say that if I was accused of something like this and I wasn't guilty, I didn't do it would be the first words out of my mouth that wouldn't come after 8 paragraphs. And I wouldn't wait months and months and months to make a statement like that. I would have made a statement like that the moment that the charges were leveled. And I would have said, you had better provide some sort of proof for this kind of slanderous allegation, because it's not true and I didn't do it. And that's essentially what I recall Brett Kavanaugh doing. And to me, that kind of thing seems exactly the kind of measured, covered, apologetic, CYA kind of a statement. I mean, eight paragraphs of how Joe Biden is a friend of women, followed by I didn't do it, is not. It doesn't sound like a person who's innocent to me. That's just my first take on it.
So, Bill, I will tell you that I think that Mika on Morning Joe on MSNBC was fairly aggressive in her questioning, was direct, was repetitive, persistent in continually trying to get Biden to answer a couple of specific questions, which I'll mention in a minute here. But let me get right to the point of what I think was missing from that interview. And that is that when Senator Joe Biden, or Vice President Joe Biden, rather, I think at the time, was making a big deal about how women should be believed and how Christine Blasey Ford's testimony was important, back then the Democrats were saying we should believe all women. Now he's saying women must be heard. He doesn't say believed. And then the facts must be determined because the truth actually matters. And
it does, I guess.
Yeah, what Mika did not press him on was saying, okay, given that interpretation of events, in hindsight, because Christine Blasey Ford, Brett Kavanaugh's accuser, was not able to bring facts to the fore, was not able to prove the case, does somebody owe Associate Justice Brett Kavanaugh an apology? And that was the only question that I felt Mika should have asked and did not.
Well, now you know why it was an MSNBC interview and not a BillWhittle.com interview or a Daily Wire interview or why Steve Crowder did an interview or Dennis Prager or Mark Levin or anybody else who would have asked some questions like that. Did she ask him about the fact that there was corroboration for her charges?
They didn't directly get into the details of the incident itself. Most of the thrust of the interview was basically Biden saying, I didn't do it, and saying that he has directed the appropriate authorities in the Senate to ask the National Archives to release any complaints that Tara Reade or anybody else may have filed against him at that time or in any time since. However, Mika kept going after this other issue and says, well, there's some 1,800 boxes of the Biden Senate papers papers that are housed at the University of Delaware, and they were going to be released, but then the University of Delaware, once Joe Biden announced he was running for president this year, backed off and said they wouldn't be released until later. And Mika's basically saying to Joe, why don't you demand that they do a search right now for any mention of Tara Reade? And Joe's answer to that was, well, these aren't personnel files. And the reason why I don't ask for that is because there's nothing there.
Well, they may be right about that. The internet is so full of rumor and unsubstantiated reports. I wasn't able to track this one down. And often when a story sounds too good to be true, it often is. So with all of those caveats in place, I did read that the episode of Larry King where was it her father who called?
Her mother.
Her mother.
Tara Reade's mother. We think it was Tara Reade's mother. Tara thinks it was her mother back in 1993.
I saw one story anecdotally, take it for what it's worth, that said that episode and that episode alone is missing out of the archives of the Larry King show. Whether that instance of the Larry King show is true or not, it is a signature of the left. It's a fingerprint. It's a DNA sample of leftist thinking to rewrite the past, to simply rewrite it. And because the media is so complicit in this, and since the media is supposedly the body that would be challenging any attempt to throw things down the memory hole, they get away with it. And because they get away with it, people assume that there's nothing there. When Barack Obama came out on stage at that American Flag Factory and said that he had never been in Reverend Wright's congregation when anti-white rhetoric was spouted, nobody challenged him on it. He was in there for 1,000 Sundays. We did the math. It was 1,000 Sundays he sat there. Never once did he hear this. He claimed he never did. And he certainly, Reverend Wright's flock didn't seem shocked when he did mention all of this anti-white rhetoric. So it's just plain lie, and people know it. And so what all he has to do is simply deny it, and that's going to be good enough for the mainstream media. But here's the problem with situational ethics. Situational ethics basically says that whatever you happen to think is appropriate, whatever you want to get away with at any given time, you can find an ethical justification for. So when you want to get a conservative Supreme Court justice off the consideration for the Supreme Court, then your situational ethics tell you that women must be believed no matter what, that women never lie about sexual accusations, ever. And that if charges are leveled, then the person is guilty, period. And that's what we heard during the Kavanaugh hearings. Now that it's Joe Biden and a Democrat that wants to be elected to high office, now all of a sudden, respect for rule of law has entered the discussion again, and due process and presumption of innocence, and all the things that conservatives squealed about when it was being done to Kavanaugh. And I think Joe Biden is entitled to due process, although he already has on several occasions shown that things like due process, rule of law, presumption of innocence mean nothing to him personally. But he still deserves to get it, not because of himself, because he's a despicable human being, but because these concepts are important, and because they are the foundation of the kind of society you want to live in.
That's an interesting point you bring up, Bill, because everybody acknowledges in this situation that even if the events that Tara Reade alleges had transpired, there's no chance in the world that there's going to be any kind of legal proceeding in this. So everything that we're discussing here is really about a so-called trial in the court of public opinion. And the question is, are you entitled to due process in the court of public opinion?
Yes.
Why?
Because if you are willing to say that the presumption of innocence only applies in a courtroom with a judge banging on a gavel, then you can get away with whatever you want to, do whatever you want to. Your ethics and your entire society is now predicated on the fact that as long as you can get away with it, then what's the harm? If you make the presumption of innocence conditional, like a switch that can be turned on or off, the presumption of innocence applies here, but it doesn't apply over there, then there is no presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence is like so much else that is the foundation of this country. Like so many other key concepts to this country, equal responsibility under the law, that the law applies to everybody. All of this stuff, all of it, is revolutionary. It's never happened in human history before. The presumption of innocence was invented by England and America at the time of the founding of America. It was invented by people whose morality had advanced to the point where they realized that there is no greater horror than being condemned for a crime that you didn't commit, and that in exchange for eliminating that horror, we are going to have to let criminals go free. And that's a moral decision that was made by a group by a very small group of human beings who, unique in history, decided that this was more important than locking up the bad guys, that they didn't want to live in a society where somebody could just say, I accuse you, and off you go to jail or the gulag or the dungeon or the firing squad. And so this presumption of innocence either exists or it doesn't. It's either active in America or it isn't. The freedom of speech that we have is either active in America or it's not. And that's why we should have had a second revolution, the instant that we saw signs that said free speech zone, cordoned off areas where you could protest and say what you wanted to. The entire country is a free speech zone, all of it. And these concepts are not up for discussion, because if they are up for discussion, then they lose all of their value. And their value is that they are immortal, timeless, inherent, and universal.
Well, Bill, I would suggest that they are up for discussion. And the reason they're up for discussion is because things can have happened that for which no documentation exists. No witnesses outside of the immediate parties involved exist. And if you say, let's say, for example, they go through the National Archives, and let's say that Biden reverses himself and says, yeah, go ahead, search through my papers at the University of Delaware for any mention of the name Tara Reade. And nothing comes up. And at this point, Tara Reade said that she filed a complaint. But we have no paper documentation of that complaint. There's nothing but he said, she said. He said it didn't happen. She said it did. Therefore, presumption of innocence, Biden's completely in the clear. And you and every other conservative will say, the man must be innocent because he can't get due process, or we can't produce evidence that he's guilty. Therefore, he must be innocent. Are you willing to go that far?
I'd be willing to go that far if Tara Reade's case was as strong as Blasey Ford's case, if she were to simply come out of the woods and say that this happened, and say that she has 3 friends who she talked to at the time about it happening, and then those friends come forward and say, we have no idea what she's talking about. If Tara Reade's accusation was as flimsy as Blasey Ford's, of course I'd grant Joe Biden the presumption of innocence. I grant him the presumption of innocence anyway, no matter how reprehensible it is to me. But nevertheless, these accusations are not on the same scale as Tara Reade's accusations. They're not just credible, there are records of her complaining at the time to a number of individuals, one of which at least was made public and aired. So just out of the gate, she's got more credibility than Blasey Ford did. And so these things then have to come down to what you would normally do in a case like this if you were filing civil suit against Joe Biden. You would have to have enough evidence to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that this actually happened. And there are ways to determine these kind of things. She should be able to provide details, but not too many details, because people who are inventing stories almost universally create more details than they would ever remember otherwise, and so on. And look, if it ultimately came down to that, and there was not enough corroborating evidence to provide beyond a reasonable doubt that Joe Biden did it, then she loses. The same way everybody else loses.
I don't think you'll ever get beyond a reasonable doubt, because every shred of evidence in this case comes from the mouth of the accuser.
Well, the accuser would have access to some inside information that other people wouldn't have, don't you think?
That's obviously true in any he said, she said situation, or he said, or whatever the situation.
So now if we want to talk about
contemporaneous conversations, Bill, all we're really saying is this woman's been saying for a long time that he did that. It doesn't prove that he did it.
No, it doesn't prove that he did it. However, we have a virtually limitless reel of Joe Biden inappropriately touching people on camera, in public, on stage. We have hours of it. And so you're not, to say that that's not evidence is just plain wrong.
I would say it's circumstantial and unrelated to the charges.
I would say it goes to the person's character and their standard mode of behavior, which is exhibited in public on stage. And if they're willing to do that on stage in public and not feel any remorse or sensitivity about it, I think that goes to the person's character and what that person may consider to be appropriate or not.
And undercuts the entire argument that he would have done something creepy behind closed doors and lied about it.
Why?
Because you said he's just willing to be creepy in public all the time. So therefore, that reflects on his character. Well, his character is apparently he doesn't see anything wrong with his public behavior. He doesn't think it's creepy.
Well, then he should just come out and say, well, I don't see what the problem was. But he knows this is going to cost him the nomination in the presidency. And so therefore, look, why didn't he deny this in the beginning? Why wasn't he the first voice? The second this charge hit the national news, why was he not the first person actively out there denying it, indignantly and calmly denying it?
Because he believed it was false and he didn't want to dignify it by tying up his time and putting his face on camera, having to deal with accusations about something that he believes are not true.
Well, if I'm running for president and somebody makes an accusation like that against me, if I did it, my hope would be that it would just die down by not pulling fuel on it. If I didn't do it, I would fight it to the end of my days with all of my energy. So that's what I would do. That's not evidence that Joe Biden did it. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, you have to ask yourself whether or not, now we're talking about the court of public opinion, does it seem reasonable? And I maintain that while it does seem exceedingly reasonable to me, the same standards have to apply to Joe Biden as they apply to everybody else. Every person knows. The Black Americans who celebrated O.J. Simpson's acquittal knew. Everybody knew. Everybody in that room knew. Everybody in that courtroom knew that O.J. Simpson was guilty. Everyone, including O.J., obviously. Everybody knew it. But the only way you could live with that was to say that the prosecution botched the case so badly that they didn't prove it. When Darden gave him a glove, a professional actor gave him a glove and said, try the glove on, and he couldn't make it fit. Don't ever ask a question you don't know the answer to. So it's not that O.J. Simpson wasn't guilty. It's that they didn't prove it. And this is an unpleasant consequence of this presumption of innocence. And so would Joe Biden getting away with this if he in fact did it. But we have to grant him the presumption of innocence in the same way we would have to grant it to Brett Kavanaugh and anyone else who's been accused. Now, what I do find interesting is that this sort of thing does not appear to come out of left field. This does not appear to be the kind of thing that people just do once. So Bill Clinton had these allegations follow him throughout his entire life and were perpetually denied and so on and so on. And there were eventually, 9 credible witnesses who came forward, and God knows how many who didn't. These kind of accusations were never leveled against Ronald Reagan. And so you have to ask yourself, does this seem to be, nor George Bush for that matter, I might add. And so you have to ask yourself, does this sound like something that seems to be in character with the person's behavior? And if you look at Harvey Weinstein's behavior towards people, I don't find it incredible that these charges against him at all. I believe the charges against Harvey Weinstein.
Well, this is exactly the argument that former Vice President Biden is making. He's, in addition to the other arguments he's making, he's saying, look, nobody in my office has any recollection of any complaint being filed. Nobody who has ever worked with me over the course of my long political career thinks that I'm this kind of person. We have this one individual, and he mentioned in, I believe, his Medium piece that her story has had some inconsistencies and changes, but he said on TV he's not going to go after her. He thinks that she has a right to be heard. But Biden is basically saying, look, I've been an upstanding guy all my life. Everybody knows that. Everybody who worked for me knows that. So therefore, you should believe my credibility. Are you suggesting that if they keep digging, maybe they'll find something else?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that there are two dynamics at work here. One of them is that when somebody comes forward, shows the courage to come forward, make an accusation, if the accusation was true. If it's not true, then it's not courage. It's just plain evil. But if it was true, then it's courage to stand up and say, look, this happened, and be prepared for the attacks on their character that are going to come. And anybody can ask any of Bill Clinton's serial victims about what that experience is like. But since we're talking about law now and we're talking about principle now, the fact that Joe Biden can claim that his entire staff who's worked with him for 30 or 40 years were utterly mystified by this and have no recollection of him ever behaving that way is strong evidence in Joe Biden's favor. I'd like to hear them say it personally rather than him assert that, but that is evidence in Joe Biden's favor. And you're right, it's not a legal case. It's not. It's the court of public opinion. But the issue is really, honestly, the issue is, with all due respect to Ms. Reade, who either made this up or didn't. And if she didn't, then she suffered a long time about this. But with all due respect to her and the individual charges in this particular case, that's not really the issue. The issue is that Joe Biden, the Democrats, all of them, witch hunted Brett Kavanaugh and destroyed the rule of law, destroyed due process, and destroyed the presumption of innocence in order to get political gains. And now that the shoe is on the other foot, now all of a sudden they become champions of this idea. And all I'm saying is, you should be champions of this presumption of innocence regardless of whether they're aimed at you or at somebody else. That's what they're there for. And my criticism of Joe Biden is not really limited to, in fact, it really has nothing to do with Tara Reade, because I simply don't know. I have an opinion, but it's an opinion. But what I do know, what I absolutely do know, is that Joe Biden and every other senior Democratic politician in the country was willing to abandon the essential protections that make Americans free and keep us out of a life of perpetual fear in order to gain political power over the one instrument that the progressives have to move this country, and that's the Supreme Court. Nobody wants their policies. Nobody votes for them. That's why they have to lie about what they want. And so if he's willing to abandon these protections for other people in order to gain political power, there's a certain justice in those charges rebounding to him and bringing him down. But I'm not one of those people who says that, well, since he didn't believe Nick Kavanaugh, that he's not entitled to the right of presumption of innocence either. Because if I agree to that particular premise, then once again, I've made the presumption of innocence conditional. And it's not conditional. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who it is. Let me just go ahead and say this. Adolf Hitler has the presumption of innocence, but the evidence against Adolf Hitler is so monumental that this shows you why the presumption of innocence is actually a sound idea. He's a perfect example of why this is a sound idea. Well, you said you killed all these Jews. I didn't. I said I didn't. There is monumental evidence to show that he did. And so, rightfully enough, even with the presumption of innocence, we know that he did these things. This is the entire point of the presumption of innocence. The presumption of innocence is not a get out of jail free card, and it is not hey, I'm automatically innocent because I said I didn't do it. That's not what the presumption of innocence is. The presumption of innocence is you must start with the innocence of the person until a case proving them guilty beyond reasonable doubt can be achieved. And if it can be achieved, then the person is guilty. And his denials have nothing to do with it. Everybody in prison is innocent. There's not a murderer in prison, not one. Just ask him.
So it's interesting because Biden himself said during the Mika interview that when a woman comes forward with charges like this, we should assume she's telling the truth, but then we should investigate. And I thought, that's kind of an inversion of the whole idea of the presumption of innocence. That's the presumption of accuracy on the part of the accuser. I'm not sure that former Senator Biden wants to follow that path where it goes.
No, he doesn't. And once again, we come to a sort of, not legal justice, but poetic justice, in the sense that this all women must be believed was interpreted to mean that all women are telling the truth. And that's clearly not the case. Clearly. That's clearly not the case. it suited them to equate those two things, to say that all women must be believed. They equated with all women are telling the truth. That suited them. Now that one of their own, in fact, not one of their own, now that what they perceive to be the only person who can stop Orange Man is accused of the same things, all of a sudden they've discovered the rule of law. But what I think is a fair statement is not that when we're talking about sexual abuse and intimidation and all the rest of it. I think what we really should be saying, I think we can all agree with this as a group of decent people on the left and the right, is rather than saying all women must be believed to the degree that they're automatically telling the truth, what we should be saying is that all women who make these charges should be taken seriously. Now, that's an entirely different thing. If you say that they should be taken seriously, then that means if a woman has an allegation of sexual abuse by a more powerful male, and this has been going on since there have been men and women, if a woman makes a charge of sexual misconduct, then she needs to be taken seriously. But that's not the same thing as that she needs to be automatically telling the truth, because clearly Glassy Ford was not telling the truth. So if you're willing to make that simple, reasonable adjustment, then everybody is happy if you're after justice. But if you're after political power to smear people, then you've just been hoisted by your own petard. By the way, for many people who may have heard that expression, a petard is a small explosive that you basically nail to the door of a castle that you're trying to blow up. And if it explodes too early, you're blown up with it. You're hoisted by your own petard. You've set a trap, you've set an explosive, and then the explosive comes back and blows you up. And that's exactly what's happened with this interpretation on the part of feminists that all women are telling the truth all the time. Now, all of a sudden, well, if that's true, then Joe Biden can't be your presidential nominee, can he? So now all of a sudden we're rediscovering the rule of law. And I think the only good thing that's going to come out of this is it will be quite difficult for them to go back to plan A after moving, however reluctantly, to a realization that the reason we have these protections in our society is because it is essentially effortless to accuse somebody of something. And nobody wants to live in a world where a simple accusation means the end of your freedom, the end of your life, the end of your job, or whatever else the case may be.
We work for a growing group of people who take these kinds of issues very seriously. They're people who love liberty, who love our Constitution, who love the rule of law. They're called the members at BillWhittle.com, and they joined by going to that website and clicking that Become a Member link, which we invite you to do right now if you also take these issues seriously. We'd also like to point your direction. If you like what you're seeing here, you're going to love our friends over at the Patriot Post. We'll provide a link in the description below, but you'll definitely want to check them out. And if you do so now using that link, it'll take you to a page where you can sign up for a free email alert that'll give you the latest conservative opinion and even humor on a regular basis. But you're also going to get a free copy of the Patriots Primer on American Liberty. And if you haven't gone back and reanalyzed the foundations of what makes this nation great, now's the best time to do it. You got a little bit of time on your hands before the country completely reopens and we're all back to full-time work. Take advantage of that and click that link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.